Hello friends! Today we're going to talk about how to write believable characters. So the first thing when we're thinking about writing believable characters is we want to think about what mechanics make it so that characters are believable. Well, when we look at all of the different books that we've read and all of the characters that we've fallen in love with, we find that they have a lot of different things in common. The first is that they have dialogue that makes sense. They really sound and come alive in our minds. Their voices are unique. The second thing is they have a unique and compelling backstory. We are interested about their past. If we don't know their past, we're compelled by the mystery that their presumed backstory entails. And let me give you a hint, that's because the writer knows their backstory, but isn't revealing it. And so then the third thing is we're compelled that we really fall in love with their actions, the choices, and we understand their motivations. The motivations that they have sometimes aren't good, but we get them, and that makes them believable and understandable and makes them into real people. The fourth thing that we really comes to light in characters that we love are their inner voice and their sense of emotional response. These are things that we relate to as human beings when we really can say, when we can really step into the character's mind and say, I would think that way, or I don't understand that, but I empathize with you anyway. That really serves to create a believable character. The final mechanic that we look into when we're looking at characters that we love being developed well is their corporeality makes sense. So basically, the way they respond to their environment makes sense based on who they appear to be by outside forces. So if you have a character that is of a different race than the society that they live in, be that a fantasy society or just the world that we live in, they're going to live their lives out differently. And in order for our characters to be believable, that needs to factor in, because surprise, things like race and sexual orientation and gender do matter when it comes to the way characters are perceived and the way they interact and move through the world. It's a big surprise, right? So creating a believable character is derived out of understanding. It's derived out of cohesion between all of the 5 things that I just listed. So your voice, the character's voice and their dialogue, has to match their backstory. You know, if they're from the South, we expect them to have a Southern accent. Their voice also needs to match the relationships. So the way they talk when they're speaking to their boss or they're speaking to their significant other, we should expect those things to be different. The next thing that we want to keep cohesive is actions. Actions ought to coincide with consistent motivations. And basically, your character needs to be motivated to do something. It's not just because they're the protagonist of your story. It's not just because they're in a situation. They need to be motivated by something. Sometimes in horror, it's as simple as self-preservation, but that motivation has to be there, and their actions that are derived out of that must be consistent. And then the next thing is inner voice. We want inner voice to reflect and respond to their backstory. You know, if they were really abused as a child, when you are conveying that, or after you've finished conveying that, and we as a reader know and understand that, their inner voice has to match that. We would expect an inner voice that is very self-critical. We'd expect an inner voice that really has to do a lot of work to overcome pressing self-doubt. The next thing is emotional responses. We want to make sure that our responses to in a situation is filtered through that character's positionality, so filtered through their corporeality. Because if you walk into a bar and it's full of Ku Klux Klansmen, your experience is going to be far different if you are yourself a Klansman, if you are white, or if you're black. Your life is going to be so much different based upon the way you move through the world that we need to keep that in mind. And we need to keep in mind how that affects and changes emotional response. So really, we're wondering, as a writer, how the heck do I get these things to seed throughout my story in a way that doesn't feel like cramming backstory and cramming stuff down people's throats, because it's never good. That's never good. And the way is to resist the urge to over-explain and allow your character to become known to us through their actions and through their motivations naturally. So here are a few rules that you can follow when doing your writing, and things that you can check for after you're done your writing to make sure that your characters are going to be perceived as believable. The first thing is provide just enough backstory so that your reader can understand the story. We as writers, we think of characters in our minds and we just love them so much that we know everything about them. Well, surprise, that's not all necessary to understand the story. All you need is enough sprinklings of backstory flavor so that their response to a monster coming trying to eat them will be predictable and understandable. The second rule is don't tell your readers characteristics or developments that are going to naturally show themselves through dialogue and action, because it's so much more effective and powerful when you say he blew his nose in the sheets instead of he was a slob and nobody liked him. The third thing is don't make your characters too perfect. Don't make them too talented. Don't make them too much of anything. And that's because we as human beings are flawed. And if our characters are not flawed, or if they're way too flawed to the point where they're just broken pieces of nothing, they're either named Griffin, or they're unbelievable characters. And they really shouldn't make their way into your story, because your characters aren't going to be able to identify or understand them. Also, it makes them dealing with conflict way too easy. Let's talk about some practical tips. What is the nitty-gritty way that you can have good character development versus bad? Well, the first thing that you can do, practical tips, is first characterize your characters using other characters. It's interesting how much more effective and powerful it is to have a character describe to another character, oh, that grouchy man down the street, he's a douchebag, than it is to, in your narrator voice, explain, Mr. Ratchet was awful. The next thing you can do, surprise, is have unique and interesting dialogue. Well, easier said than done, but if you have unique and interesting dialogue, your character development tends to follow very well. The next thing that you can do that is a practical tip for having good character development is stick your character, whether it's your main character or a side character, stick them with one key internal conflict, and then watch your story progress and make sure that they overcome that conflict and stick with it, because you can always add in more conflict later after the fact, but you really want to make sure that the primary one that they're going to deal with is effective and it's well, and that their character arc is managed properly. Bad ways to develop character. A bad way to develop your character is by lecturing to your readers. Just not effective. It doesn't work. It bores and slows your story to a crawl. Instead, it's better to trickle things in nice and slow so that we get to know your character naturally, instead of dumping it on your reader right away, right from the front. Now let's look at some horror-specific tips. Horror is my favorite genre. It's what I write in. I love it. I love killing people. It's fantastic. Love monsters. But a key trope that we see all the way through slasher movies, that we see in every single bad horror book that has ever been written, is characters that were written specifically to die, and it shows. You want to be extra careful that you're monitoring your proportioning of character development and your pacing of character development, especially with characters that you would consider throwaways. This is because it's so obvious when you have an underdeveloped character that they are going to die. But if you have a character that you've developed and built up to be a really strong secondary character that is almost a protagonist in their own right, and you go ahead and kill them, oh my gosh, it's delicious. We have the best effect ever, and your readers don't see it coming. You might get some hate mail, but it's effective. Another thing, when you're writing good monsters in the horror genre, it's good to use your monster to force character development. You want it to be so that it forces your protagonist to grow or die. Quite literally often. That's all I got for you today. Make sure to like and subscribe.